Hello, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. If we look at the L-mount lenses lined up, while the L-mount is still a relatively young format, there are already quite a lot of lenses available, especially if you are someone who prefers to use some of the slightly smaller lenses. Panasonic, they have created 5 Lumix S f1.8 prime lenses, which are all really nice and compact. They have also created some affordable and relatively compact zoom lens, including the Lumix S 2260 f3.5 to 5.6 standard zoom lens, which is a lens that I absolutely love. And there's also the Lumix S 70-300 f4.5 to 5.6 OIS telephoto zoom lens. These two lenses together covers a pretty good range of focal length that we usually use. But what about ultra wide angle lens? Well, we have the Lumix S Pro 16-35 f4, which is a very nice lens that is also certified by Leica. But if you pair it with the Lumix S 20-60mm lens, it is only 4mm wider at the wide end. Well, when we talk about ultra wide angle lens, 4mm is quite a big difference, but its focal length is really heavily overlapping the Lumix S 20-60mm lens. I guess another big problem is that the price of the Lumix S Pro 16-35mm lens is around $1,500 While I think it's worth the price, but for people who bought the S5 or S5 II, they would probably want something that is a little bit more affordable. But now we have a new choice, and it is this Lumix S 14-28 f4 to 5.6 lens. So in this video, we are going to have a look at the image quality, build quality, and also design of this new ultra wide angle zoom lens. We're also going to do some comparison with the Lumix S Pro 16-35 f4 lens and see whether it is a good idea to buy this affordable ultra wide angle zoom lens, or should we spend more money and buy the Leica certified Lumix S Pro 16-35 instead. Now there's one thing I want to show you guys, and let's go out first. Okay, now we have the Lumix S Pro 16-35mm f4 lens and also the new Lumix S 14-28mm lens, and I just want to show you a comparison between these two lenses in terms of how wide this lens can capture. So let's start with the 16-35mm lens and start with its telephoto end. And now let's start with the 35mm, and this is what you can see at 35mm. Alright, and now let's switch to the wide end. This is 16mm. This is what you can see at 16mm. Okay, now I'm going to swap it to the Lumix 14-28mm lens. Okay, now we swap to the Lumix S 14-28mm lens, and right now it is at the long end, 28mm. This is what it looks like. And now 14mm. As you can probably see, there is quite a big difference between the wide end of these two lenses. The 14-28mm lens can definitely capture quite a bit wider than the 16-35mm lens, but on the other hand, the 16-35mm can capture quite a bit tighter if you want, compared to the 14-28mm lens. Okay, now I hope you have a better idea about the difference in focal length or view angle between these two lenses. And next, let's have a look at the image quality. Let's start with the image sharpness. Before we start, I want to quickly mention one thing. Pretty much all the first-party mirrorless lenses these days are designed to take advantage of the lens profile correction to correct some of the imperfections. This is very different to the older days when everything is just purely optics. So in this review and other reviews in the foreseeable future on this channel, I will do all the image quality tests with the lens profile correction enabled, as this is how most users are going to use the lens. But for some of the tests like distortion, I will also try to test it with the lens profile correction disabled so you can see what the profile correction is doing. But yes, if I don't mention anything in the review, then you can just assume this test is done with the lens profile correction enabled. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness. At the wide end 14mm, look at the center, and the lens is already very sharp at f4 and will continue like that until we reach f16 when diffraction starting to soften up the image a little bit. If we look at the corner, at f4 the corner sharpness is actually pretty decent too. Not as sharp as the center, but it is very usable. Focusing the photo at the center or focusing at the corner of the photo doesn't seem to make any difference to the corner sharpness, so it suggests the lens has very minimal amount of field curvature. When I stop down the lens further, the corner sharpness still remains very similar, maybe improved by a tiny amount until we reach f16, then starting to become a little bit softer. So if you want to get sharp photo at the wide end of this 14 to 28mm lens, you could just shoot at f4, as stopping down the lens doesn't really make too much difference at all, well, at least in terms of image sharpness. But there are other reasons that you may want to stop down the lens a bit, and I will show you the reason very soon. Next, we'll have a look at 16mm focal length, and that is because this is the focal length that I can compare with the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35 f4 lens. We will zoom in the center first. Both lenses are already very sharp at the maximum aperture. Stopping down the lens doesn't really make any difference in terms of center sharpness or contrast until diffraction kicks in at around f16. And now look at the corner. At the maximum aperture, both lenses has very similar sharpness. The sharpness is good, very acceptable. I see a tiny bit of chromatic aberration from the 16 to 35 f4 lens, which I don't see from the 14 to 28mm lens. But I really mean a tiny bit of chromatic aberration, as I have to zoom in the photo to 400% zoom to see that. Just like the test I did at 14mm focal length, stopping down these two lenses at 16mm focal length would only marginally improve the corner sharpness. Once again, focusing at the center or focusing at the corner doesn't really make any noticeable difference to the corner sharpness. Next, we'll have a look at 28mm focal length, which is the longest focal length for the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens. So here are the comparison photos from these two lenses. Look at the center. The sharpness is already excellent at wide open, and it remains excellent until diffraction kicks in at around f16. And if we look at the corner at 28mm focal length, both lenses have acceptable corner sharpness at their maximum aperture. But if I compare them at f5.6, then the 16 to 35mm f4 lens is a little bit sharper than the 14 to 28mm lens. Stopping down the lens will give you small improvement in corner sharpness until you reach around f16. Focusing the photo at center or at the corner doesn't really give me any noticeable difference in terms of corner sharpness. It means these two lenses both have very minimal amount of field curvature. A wide angle 14 to 28mm f4 to 5.6 zoom lens is usually not a lens that I would worry too much about the bokeh, but because this lens can focus really close, so you could still dissolve the background quite a bit when you are taking close-up photos. The bokeh, I think it looks alright. It doesn't look distracting, and sometimes it actually could look quite nice. But when you are shooting photos at normal distance, then you just can't really get any shadow depth of field and you won't dissolve the background much at all. Next, let's check out the vignetting performance. At wide open, vignetting is a bit noticeable, especially at the wide end. Look at these two photos shot at 14mm and 28mm, both at the maximum aperture. You can see vignetting is more obvious at the wide end. But once you stop down the lens by about 2 stops, then vignetting now become not really noticeable. If you compare the lens with the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens at 16mm, compare the wide open photo, the 16 to 35mm lens has a little bit more vignetting, but the 16 to 35mm lens is at f4, while the 14 to 28mm lens is at f4.3. So once we stop down both lenses to f5.6, then they have very similar vignetting. I think the 16 to 35mm lens actually has a little bit less vignetting. And if we compare these two lenses at 28mm focal length, at f5.6, the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens is not bad, but the 16 to 35 f4 lens is definitely better with almost no vignetting noticeable. So it seems the 16 to 35mm lens has slightly better vignetting control than the 14 to 28mm lens. But all these test results that you just saw was with the lens profile correction enabled. If we disable the lens profile correction, not surprisingly, you will see quite a bit more vignetting from both lenses, especially at the maximum aperture. Vignetting can be quite noticeable. But now, if we compare the two lenses at 16mm, both with the lens profile correction disabled, this time it's actually the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens that seems to have slightly better vignetting control. At 28mm focal length, it is the opposite. The Lumix S Pro 16 to 35 lens has slightly less vignetting. So overall, I think the vignetting performance is very similar between these two lenses. Lens profile correction helped reduce vignetting quite a bit, especially at the wide end. Another thing I want to mention is, all these photos were shot with the same white balance settings and all shot within a few minutes. But you may notice the color of the wall is slightly different. It's a bit warmer with the photos that I shot with the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens. The Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens has very good chromatic aberration control. Most of the photos have virtually no color fringing at all, even when I'm shooting at the maximum aperture. The Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens also has very good chromatic aberration control, but it seems the 16 to 35mm lens has a little bit more chromatic aberration than the 14 to 28mm lens. Thanks to the lens profile correction, both the 14 to 28mm lens and the 16 to 35mm lens shows very minimal amount of distortion in my brick wall test photos. There is a tiny bit of barrel distortion at the 14mm end with the 14 to 28mm lens, but it is really quite minimal, so I don't think you will notice that when you are taking normal real-world photos. However, if I disable the lens profile correction, then you can see the distortion pretty easily, especially at the wide end. And if I compare the two lenses at 16mm, the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens is the lens that has a little bit more distortion than the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens. Let's have a look at the lens flare performance now. First, my daytime test video that I shot directly into the sun at the maximum aperture, I think the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens flare control is excellent. But this is the same for the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens as well. Both lenses have really minimal amount of lens flare and ghosting. Color and contrast also remains excellent as well, so it's pretty much as good as you can get from any lenses. And another interesting thing is, even when I stop down the lens to f22 and shoot directly into the sun, usually there will be quite a bit of ghosting. But with both these two lenses, ghosting is kept at really minimal level. I see a little bit of ghosting with the 14 to 28mm lens at one particular angle, but overall I would still say lens flare and ghosting is extremely well controlled. And if you look at these night scene test videos, both lenses also perform really well. The 14 to 28mm lens may be even slightly better this time, but I think we would be all pretty happy with either of these lenses. So overall, lens flare performance of this new Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens is just absolutely fantastic. The Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens has a 7-braid circular aperture design, which means it should give you 14-point Sunstars when you stop down the lens. If you look at this set of test photos, I think you would agree that this Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens is really not the best lens for people who want sharp Sunstars. First, I need to stop down the lens to around f16 to see a bit of Sunstars, but even when I stop down to the minimum aperture f22, the Sunstar still doesn't look that sharp or clean to me. The tails of the Sunstar spread out quite a bit, which I personally don't really like. In comparison, the Lumix S Pro 16-35 f4 lens has better looking Sunstars. With the 9-braid aperture design, I start to get a bit of Sunstars at f11, and when I stop down to f22, the Sunstars are just much sharper. So if Sunstars is important to you, the Lumix S Pro 16-35 f4 lens is definitely a better choice. Now, the photos that I just showed you before were all shot during the night. When I did a daytime Sunstar test, I think the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens performs much better. While I think the Sunstars from the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens still looks sharper, but the difference is not that big this time. Okay, now let's have a look at the design of the lens. As mentioned at the beginning, this Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens is a variable maximum aperture zoom lens, just like the Lumix S 20 to 60 and the Lumix S 70 to 300 lens. The body design of this 14 to 28mm lens is very similar to the Lumix S 20 to 60mm lens, very similar in size and construction. It is a weather-resistant lens with multiple rubber seals, and it also has a metal lens mount. The lens is also freeze-proof down to -10 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The front element has fluorine coating to help minimize the chance of water drops or oil stick on the front of the lens. But unlike the Lumix S 20 to 60mm lens, which the length of the lens would change a bit when you zoom in and out, this new Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens, the lens length doesn't change at all no matter you zoom in or zoom out the lens. The front element does move back and forth a little bit, but that just doesn't affect the lens overall length. Comparing the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens to the Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens, the 14 to 28mm lens is a bit smaller and also a little bit lighter. However, when I put these two lenses in front of me side by side, I would say the difference in terms of size and weight is actually not as big as I thought. The zoom ring on the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens feels okay when you try to turn it. It feels very similar to the 20 to 60mm lens. The Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm lens zoom ring definitely feel a little bit better and smoother. The Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens only has a autofocus manual focus switch on the lens for you to change between autofocus and manual focus operation. So this is different to the S Pro 16 to 35mm lens, which has a focus ring clutch, which allows you to quickly change the lens between autofocus and manual focus mode. And the focus ring clutch on the 16 to 35mm lens would also allow you to quickly jump to a certain focus distance when you switch the lens to manual focus mode. This is something you can't do on the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens. Both of these ultra wide angle zoom lenses have a 77mm front filter thread. This is great for landscape photographers as you can attach a ND filter or CPL filter very easily. This is especially great for the Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens, as a lot of lenses that can reach 14mm would require special filter kit, which is large and expensive and slow to set up. So it is really great that Panasonic make this new 14 to 28mm lens able to take a normal screw-in filter. But remember, this is an ultra wide angle lens, so I wouldn't recommend you to stack multiple filters, especially if you want to shoot at 14mm focal length. The Lumix S 14-28 is a variable maximum aperture lens, which means the maximum aperture would change as you zoom in or out. So here is a chart that show you the lens maximum aperture at different focal length. Compared it with the Lumix S Pro 16-35mm lens, at the wide end, there isn't really too much difference in terms of maximum aperture, but as the focal length increase, the maximum aperture would also increase pretty much linearly in number, so it becomes one stop slower than the Lumix S Pro 16-35mm lens at 28mm focal length. The Lumix S 14-28mm lens has a high-speed autofocus motor that can work at 240 frames per second. The autofocus speed when taking photo in single autofocus mode is very fast and almost instant, and also very quiet as well. I almost can't hear any autofocus noise at all, even in this pretty quiet room, unless I put my ear right next to the lens. When shooting photo in AFC mode with the S5 II, the autofocus is also very smooth and also very responsive. It is an internal focus lens, so the length of the lens doesn't change at all when focusing. Like all the other Lumix S lenses, this Lumix S 14-28mm lens is designed for both photographers and videographers. The lens has very minimal amount of focus briefing. I really mean very minimal amount, no matter I'm shooting at the wide end or at the telephoto end. If you change the aperture value when you are shooting video, the aperture value transition is also very smooth, so it doesn't look distracting at all. As mentioned before, autofocus is extremely quiet, so you really won't hear any autofocus noise in your video. And if you want to manual focus, the lens support linear and non-linear manual focus mode that you can choose from the camera's setup menu. The Lumix S 14-28mm lens and the Lumix S 20-60mm lens has very similar overall length. The focus ring is also at pretty much the same position. The weight and the center of the gravity of these two lenses are also very similar. So if you have your camera on a gimbal and swapping between these two lenses, you only need to do very minimal adjustment to your gimbal. The lens also appears to have an electronic assist parfocal design. So here is a video that was shot at manual focus mode at the maximum aperture, and you can see the focus point doesn't really change when I change the focal length between the wide end and the telephoto end. Okay, now let's go outside and do a bit more outdoor testing. Since this Lumix 14-28mm lens is an ultra wide angle lens, I think a lot of people would probably interested to know whether this lens is suitable for shooting some vlogging style video. Well, I think the answer is you can use it for shooting vlogging style video, but if you are going to use it and shoot it at the wide end 14mm, which is what I'm doing right now, then you may notice some warping effect near the corner of the frame. So if you look at the corner here, then you may see a bit of warping effect. Even though right now I'm already shooting with the Lumix S5 II, which has one of the best video image stabilization system that I have ever seen, but it's just the nature of shooting with an ultra wide angle lens and without a gimbal, and if your hand is not steady, then you would still see a bit of warping effect at the corner. It's just something that is really hard to avoid. Now, of course, you can zoom in and shoot at the
longer end. Like for me, I like to shoot my vlogging style video at around 20mm. Maybe can go slightly wider, but then you see a bit of warping effect. So yeah, around 20mm is good. But then I would ask the question, if you are shooting at 20mm and you probably would already have the 20 to 60mm kit lens, then that lens is probably just as good, if not a better choice for shooting vlogging style video. However, there's one reason why this lens could be better than the 20-60mm lens, and that is if you want to shoot your video in 4K 50 or 4K 60, which is what I've just switched the camera to record right now. If you do that with most of the current L-mount full frame camera, especially all the one with the 24 megapixel sensor, and you would have a 1.5 crop, the APS-C crop, when you switch to 4K 50 or 4K 60. And with the 1.5 crop, then 14mm become 21mm, and that would be quite a good focal length for shooting vlogging style video. And at the same time, the warping effect would be a lot less noticeable now, because you crop in quite a bit, your focal length is now equivalent focal length is quite a bit longer, so you probably won't see much warping effect compared to shooting in the full frame mode. So yeah, if you are planning to shoot in 4K 50 or 60, or maybe you're using one of the APS-C L-mount camera, then this 14 to 28mm lens could be a very good choice for you if you want to shoot some vlogging style video.
So if you are interested in buying this lens to shoot some vlogging style video, let me show you how the different focal length would affect the field of view and also the image warping effect at the corner of the frame. Here are 4 videos that I shot with my hand holding the camera with my arm fully extended. The focal length is at 14mm, 16mm, 18mm and 20mm. So you can see how the different focal length would affect the image composition when the camera is kept at the same distance from my face, and you can also see the image warping effect at the corner. It becomes less noticeable as the focal length is increased. One thing I want to mention is, because I was just walking normally and my arm was fully extended, so the camera was definitely shaking quite a bit. If you walk and hold the camera more careful than me, the image warping effect at the corner would be a lot less noticeable. To me, I think 20mm is my favorite, but I could probably go down to 18mm if I'm a little bit more careful on how I hold the camera. But let me know what focal length is your favorite. One of the big selling points of this new Lumix S 14 to 28mm lens is that it is a macro lens. Well, technically I would call it a half macro lens because the maximum magnification is 0.5 times, not 1 time. But a lot of lens manufacturer does it for their zoom lenses as well. I remember when I bought my first Nikon DSLR camera, I bought a Sigma 70 to 300 lens, which Sigma also called it a macro lens, and the maximum magnification ratio was also 0.5 times. Anyway, to get the maximum magnification, you need to shoot at the telephoto and 28mm focal length. The Lumix S Pro 16 to 35mm f4 lens maximum magnification is not too bad at 0.23 times, but this new 14 to 28mm lens is definitely a lot better. However, one thing that you need to aware is, if you want to get the 0.5 times magnification, you need to put the lens really close to your subject. The distance between the front of the lens and the subject is only around 3 cm or just a little bit over 1 inch. That means you have to be really careful with the shadow that your camera may cast on your subject. And if you want to light up the subject using a camera flash or LED light, it could also be quite difficult. But this is a common problem or behavior if you are shooting close-up photos with an ultra wide angle lens. Any ultra wide angle lens that has a 0.5 times maximum magnification ratio or higher would be pretty much the same. And in terms of image sharpness when taking close-up photo, at the maximum aperture f5.6, the sharpness is pretty good, very usable, but stop down the lens to f8 would make the sharpness become excellent. And the sharpness remains the same when I stop down to f11. With this new Lumix S 14-28mm lens announced together with the new Lumix S52 and S52X, it really is a new face for Panasonic. I've always loved the Lumix S 20-60mm and the 70-300mm lens. Despite they are variable maximum aperture lenses, I find the image quality is more than good enough when I'm shooting real-world photos, and the focal length is just very versatile. So I took those two lenses with me to quite a few of my trips and really loved the photos and videos that I shot with these two lenses. Now this new 14-28mm lens would complete the setup and covers the ultra wide angle focal length. The overall image quality doesn't disappoint me. It has good image sharpness, great lens flare control, very good chromatic aberration control as well. It's definitely not perfect and there are a few areas that it could be slightly better, and it does rely a bit on lens profile correction to get rid of some of the distortion and vignetting, but it's very common these days for ultra wide angle or even just a normal wide angle lenses to do that. 0.5 times maximum magnification is very good, and the photo that I shot at the minimum focus distance is also pretty sharp. But as the front of the lens can get very close to your subject when you're taking photo at that maximum magnification ratio, it could be a bit challenging to light up your subject properly. Now, at least the length of the lens won't change no matter you are adjusting the focus or changing the focal length, so the front element won't suddenly crash into your subject when you are trying to adjust the zoom or focus. What I also really like is that you can use a normal 77mm screw-in front filter, so that is really great for shooting landscape photography because a lot of time you want to use a CPL or ND filter for that. And another thing I also like is that although it is kind of a entry-level lens, but it is still a weather-resistant lens, including freeze-resistant down to -10 degrees Celsius, and it has the front flooring coating, means we can use this lens pretty much anywhere, anytime. This is one thing that I really like about Panasonic Lumix S series lenses. Most other manufacturers would make their kit lens or their f1.8 prime lenses just cheap and nasty, but not Panasonic. Even the most basic lens from Panasonic still got a lot of features like weather resistant, fast and quiet autofocus motor, so even professional users could actually choose them, especially if they want to have a more compact and lightweight setup. If I compared it with the Lumix S Pro 16-35mm f4 lens, which one would I pick? Now obviously there is a very big price difference, and it is a very hard choice. Image quality wise, I originally thought this new 14-28mm lens would not be quite as good as the S Pro 16-35, but turns out they are actually really quite similar, so that's a bit of surprise to me. Size and weight, the S Pro 16-35 is definitely bigger and heavier, but to be honest, it's not a huge difference. The construction of the S Pro 16-35 definitely feels a bit more solid, and I like its focus clutch design as well. But I think the biggest difference is really the focal length. 14mm is quite a bit wider than 16mm, and you can exaggerate the perspective distortion quite a bit more with the 14-28mm lens than the 16-35mm lens. But on the other hand, the S Pro 16-35 can cover up to 35mm focal length, so that makes it more suitable as a general walk-around lens, especially if you are someone like me who really loves the 35mm focal length. I guess for some users, they may not like the fact that this new S 14-28mm lens is a variable maximum aperture lens. So do I want it to be a constant maximum aperture lens? Well, yes, of course, but if Panasonic make this 14 to 28mm lens a f4 constant aperture lens, then I guess the weight, the size, and also the price of this lens would need to be all increased quite a bit, so it would be pretty much the same as the S Pro 16 to 35mm f4 lens and just too similar. So if you really need a constant aperture lens for practical reasons, maybe you can just treat it as a constant aperture f5.6 lens. Now, I think most of you guys would probably have already watched my Lumix S5 II review and a few other related videos, but if you haven't, I think you really should check them out, as I have done tons of testing and I'm sharing all my test results with you guys in my Lumix S5 II videos.